World War II, which began in September 1939, was the largest and most destructive military conflict in history, involving nations from every continent and resulting in a devastating number of casualties. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, faced the Allied powers, including the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Although the war began in Europe, where Germany under Adolf Hitler invaded Poland, the fighting quickly spread to other parts of the world, creating battlefronts in Africa, the Pacific, and even South America, where spies and agents from both sides competed for information. As the war dragged on, the Allies began to gain the upper hand, especially after the involvement of the United States, which became one of the main contributors to the defeat of the Axis powers. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the entry of the United States into the conflict was a turning point, and by 1945, the Allies were nearing victory in both hemispheres. In Europe, Germany was collapsing with the surrender of Berlin in May of that year, while in the Pacific, Japan continued to fight fiercely. Despite its depleted army, its population suffering from naval blockade and aerial bombardment, and its declining industrial and military capacity. However, Japan's resistance was fierce, and the Japanese government, led by Emperor Hirohito and his ministers and generals, was determined to fight to the last consequence, believing that ultimate victory was still possible, or at least that resistance could provide a more favorable peace negotiation. Although the United States was already considering a military solution, there was a stalemate on how to force Japan's surrender without the need for a direct invasion, which was anticipated to be not only incredibly bloody, but also extremely costly in terms of human lives. In this context, a weapon of mass destruction which could force Japan to surrender immediately without the need for an invasion seemed to be a viable solution. It was at this moment that the development of the atomic bomb through the Manhattan Project began to stand out as a decisive strategy. The Manhattan Project was a secret collaborative effort involving the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, with the participation of some of the most brilliant scientists of the time, including the physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who would become known as the father of the atomic bomb. The project was initiated in and the objective was clear: to create a weapon capable of releasing an immense amount of energy from nuclear fission. On July 16, 1945, the project reached a historic milestone with the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb in the Alamogordo Desert, New Mexico. The explosion, nicknamed Trinity, was a technical success, but it also brought to light a new and terrifying reality about humanity's destructive power. However, a major political and moral question remained. How would the United States, under the leadership of President Harry S. Truman, use this new weapon? Although Japan was nearly defeated, the Japanese imperial regime refused to surrender unconditionally, and the alternative of a full-scale invasion with its devastating death toll still seemed to be the primary option for many strategists. In the midst of this crucial decision, Truman, who had assumed the presidency in April 1945 after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, was only beginning to understand the extent of the power he held in his hands. Truman was informed of the success of the Manhattan Project and, soon after, received advice from military and political leaders about the use of the bomb. The United States government faced a weighty decision to attack Japanese cities with the atomic bomb, an action that could force Japan to surrender or to seek diplomatic alternatives, knowing that an invasion of Japan or the continuation of the war would cause an even greater number of casualties, both on the American and Japanese sides. Truman, who had not been informed of all the details of the Manhattan Project before his rise to the presidency, now found himself facing the difficult task of making the decision to authorize the use of the bomb. He had to weigh the available options, considering the possible consequences not only for the war, but also for the political and moral future of the United States in the post-war period. The decision he made would irreversibly change the course of world history. Meanwhile, Japan was already grappling with the brunt of incendiary bombs dropped on its cities, such as Tokyo, where hundreds of thousands of civilians had died. The use of such weapons had already caused immense destruction, but the atomic bomb offered even greater power, something that could theoretically break Japan's resistance more quickly and effectively. However, a fundamental question hung in the air. Would it be moral to use a weapon that would cause so much destruction, especially against civilians, to end the war? And more importantly, who should make that decision? The decision to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 was not a simple or unanimous choice. Although the use of the bomb was a tactical war move, it was made after profound considerations of the political, military, and moral implications, and especially after intense counseling that the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, received from his advisors and generals. The war against Japan, even with the advance of Allied forces, was far from being resolved simply, and the United States military leaders were desperate for a quick solution that would avoid an invasion of Japan, which was proving increasingly unlikely and highly costly. Before authorizing the use of the atomic bomb, Truman received advice from his military advisors on several alternatives. One was to continue the intense bombing of Japanese cities, which had already led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians and the destruction of important urban centers. Another plan was to launch a direct invasion of the Japanese islands, a process that, according to military calculations, would cost hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese lives. The human cost of this strategy was terrifying, and the possibility of defeating Japan without a direct invasion seemed the best solution. However, there was an even more urgent reason for using the bomb: the need to end the war before the Soviet Union could expand its influence in the Pacific. The Soviet government had committed to entering the war against Japan in August 19 after Germany's surrender, but many feared that the Soviets would seize control of areas in Japan or China, altering the balance of power in the post-war period. For the United States, the use of the atomic bomb could not only force Japan to surrender immediately, but also guaranteed American primacy in the post-war global order without Soviet interference. The post-war planning committee, formed to analyze the possible consequences of using the bomb, was one of those responsible for gathering the data necessary for Truman to make the final decision. This committee, which included some of the most prominent scientists and military figures of the time, such as Leslie Groves, responsible for the Manhattan Project, and J. Robert Oppenheimer, the chief scientist, played a crucial role in preparing for the bomb's launch. They argued that using the bomb could not only save lives, but would also serve as a powerful political message to the Soviet Union, which did not yet possess nuclear weapons. At the same time, other Truman advisors were aware of the moral consequences of its potential use. Many in the government, including some members of the military and the State Department, warned that such a devastating attack could be seen as an inhumane act, especially against a nation already deeply weakened. In addition, there was concern about the long-term effects of radiation, which were not fully understood at the time, but which could harm not only Japanese civilians but also future generations. The climate of tension and urgency led Truman to make a decision that would forever mark his legacy and the history of the world. The use of the atomic bomb would not only hasten the end of the war, but also usher in a new era in world geopolitics characterized by the constant threat of nuclear destruction. Truman, pressured by military advice and the desire to secure a decisive victory, authorized the dropping of the bombs, but also made it clear that the objective was not to destroy the population, but rather to force an immediate surrender from Japan. Truman's decision was, therefore, more than a simple military choice. It was a choice of total war, involving a combination of political, strategic, and ultimately moral factors. The idea that a single attack could change the course of history was what motivated the use of the bomb. But at the same time, this decision brought with it a new and terrifying understanding of the destructive power of science. The Manhattan Project, which led to the development of the atomic bomb, was a highly secret and groundbreaking research effort involving scientists, engineers, and military personnel from several nations, but was primarily conducted by the United States, beginning in 1942. The project was a response to the growing threat that Nazi Germany could be the first to develop a nuclear weapon. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis had shown interest in the use of nuclear weapons, and the fear that they might succeed led to an unprecedented scientific mobilization. The idea of splitting the atom, releasing enormous amounts of energy, had been known since the 1930s. However, it was only in 1938, with the discoveries of nuclear fission by Otto Hahn and Fritz, that it became clear that a nuclear chain reaction could be controlled to release a massive amount of energy. When Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard alerted President Franklin D. Roosevelt to the military potential of nuclear fission in 1939, the United States government initiated what would become the Manhattan Project. Initially, the idea was to prevent the Nazis from gaining access to nuclear technology, but the concern soon transformed into a broader effort to create a nuclear weapon that would be decisive in the war. The construction of the project was a gigantic undertaking with several facets. One of the main research centers was located in Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the leadership of theoretical physicist Robert Oppenheimer. The project brought together scientists from around the world, including figures such as Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman, and Leo Szilard, many of whom had fled the Nazi regime and moved to the United States. Oppenheimer's selection as scientific director was crucial as he possessed the talent and ability to coordinate the diverse areas of research necessary for the development of the bomb. The Manhattan Project was not limited to the creation of the atomic bomb. It also involved a series of logistical and engineering issues. For the project to succeed, it was necessary to secure sufficient sources of uranium and plutonium, as well as to build the industrial facilities to produce these materials on a massive scale. Uranium-235, the isotope needed for fission, was rare, and plutonium-239. Another fundamental element was produced in special nuclear reactors. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, one of the most important factories was established to enrich uranium, a task that involved methods such as gaseous diffusion and centrifugation. Most of the plutonium research was carried out in Hanford, Washington, where one of the first industrial-scale nuclear reactors was built. The facilities in Oak Ridge and Hanford worked together to supply the materials needed for the bombs. While Los Alamos was responsible for the design of the weapon itself, the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project faced monumental technical challenges. The theory of the nuclear chain reaction was already well established, but building a bomb capable of triggering such a devastating explosion was a completely new task. In addition, the researchers were aware of the potential risks involved. Initially, there were even discussions about the possibility that the nuclear chain reaction could, in theory, ignite the Earth's atmosphere. However, these concerns were eventually dismissed and the project moved forward throughout 1944 and 1945. The scientists of the Manhattan Project reached an agreement on the type of bomb that would be developed. The uranium bomb, called Little Boy, would use uranium-235 as nuclear fuel, while the plutonium bomb, called Fat Man, would use plutonium-2. Both bombs would be based on the principle of implosion. A subcritical mass of nuclear material would be compressed to a critical point, initiating a nuclear chain reaction. In July 1945, the tests culminated in the Trinity test, the first nuclear explosion in history, carried out in the Alamogordo Desert, New Mexico. The explosion was so powerful that it created a fireball that lit up the sky for dozens of kilometers around. The detonation made it clear that the atomic bomb was a real and immensely powerful weapon, capable of destroying entire cities and altering the course of war. Although the test was a technical success, it also brought with it a series of ethical and philosophical questions. Many of the scientists who participated in the Manhattan Project, including Oppenheimer, began to question the implications of what they had created. The bomb was a scientific marvel, but also a weapon of mass destruction with the potential to kill tens of thousands of people in a single blow. However, the scientists were at a point of no return, and pressure from the United States government, coupled with the desire to win the war quickly, was enough to keep the project going. In August 1945, the world was about to witness the first use of nuclear weapons in combat, with the bombs prepared to be dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The weeks that followed the Trinity test would be decisive not only for the war, but for the future of humanity. The atomic bomb was no longer just a theoretical idea. It had become a terrifying reality that would forever change the nature of armed conflict and international relations. The Manhattan Project was a monumental technological achievement, but also a moral and political turning point. The race to create the atomic bomb, driven by the urgency of war and the need to ensure the military supremacy of the United States, generated a weapon whose power was virtually unimaginable. The decision to use this weapon and the events that followed would leave an indelible mark on the history of the 20th century. Harry S.C. Truman, who assumed the presidency of the United States after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945, was a central figure in the decision to use the atomic bomb on Japan. His role in this process was not only to ratify a decision already made, but to be the leader who had to face the reality of a prolonged and devastating war with millions of lives at stake, while weighing the ramifications of a historic choice. Truman was not fully prepared for the presidency when he took office, as his political and diplomatic experience was limited. He had been vice president during Roosevelt's third term, but the relationship between the two was relatively distant. Roosevelt, who had a clear vision of foreign policy and war strategies, did not share with Truman all the details of the development of the Manhattan Project and the plans for the use of the atomic bomb. When Truman took office, he had to familiarize himself with many important decisions in a short period of time. One of the first major decisions Truman had to make was how to end the war in the Pacific. In July 1945, when Truman was already in office, The Allies had defeated Germany, but Japan continued to resist. Despite massive air raids and increasing military pressure, the Japanese government refused to accept the unconditional surrender demanded by the Allies. Japanese forces were increasingly desperate and prepared to fight to the last man, which indicated that an invasion of the Japanese islands would be a bloody task with immense humanitarian and military costs. At the same time, the Soviet Union was also preparing to enter the war against Japan, since it had fulfilled its promise to attack the Japanese Empire in the Pacific after Germany's surrender. However, for Truman, the issue was not just defeating Japan. It was ensuring that the United States maintained geopolitical superiority in the post-war period, especially over the expanding Soviet Union. It was in this high-pressure environment that Truman was briefed on the atomic bomb and the success of the Manhattan Project. He was briefed on the details of the nuclear weapons development and the prospects for its use. The bomb's destructive power was clear, and early attempts to persuade the American government indicated that using the bomb would be a decisive way to end the war without the need for an invasion that would result in hundreds of thousands of deaths. Both American and Japanese, the military, including General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, insisted that the atomic bomb could be the key to forcing Japan to surrender without further delay and without further significant human losses. The post-war planning committee, created by the United States government, discussed possible alternatives to the use of the bomb. Some of these alternatives included an invasion of Japan, which was already being planned under the name Operation Downfall, and increased conventional bombing. However, these options had a significant human cost, with estimates indicating that an invasion would result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and millions of Japanese civilians. On the other hand, some members of Truman's administration and his inner circle, such as Secretary of War Henry Stimson, argued that using the atomic bomb would be justified as a means of avoiding a prolonged and painful invasion. Although there was debate about the use of the bomb, voices in favor of its use stood out. Truman, in turn, was pressured to make a quick and effective decision, as the war in the Pacific showed no signs of an imminent end. In addition to military pressure and the urgency of the war, Truman was also dealing with the growing dominance of the Soviet Union in Europe. Japanese resistance in the Pacific was seen as an opportunity for the United States not only to end the war but also to establish its position as the dominant post-war power without Soviet interference. Although the decision to use the atomic bomb was largely motivated by strategic and military considerations, it was also shaped by the geopolitics of the time. During internal government discussions, Truman had to deal with differences of opinion among members of the planning committee and his key advisors. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, expressed reservations about the use of the bomb. He believed that Japan's surrender was imminent, especially after the massive bombing raids on Japanese cities and the destruction of the country's infrastructure. Eisenhower also had concerns about the moral consequences of such a devastating attack on civilians, but his objections were not enough to change the course taken by the Truman administration. Presidential advisor James F. Burns, who had great influence over Truman, was one of the most ardent advocates for the use of the atomic bomb. Burns believed that the use of the bomb would hasten the end of the war and also show the world, especially the Soviet Union, that the United States possessed superior technology. Burns argued that the show of force would help shape the post-war geopolitical landscape in favor of the United States, providing a crucial strategic advantage. Truman, therefore, found himself confronted with a historic decision that involved not only the immediate well-being of American troops, but also future international relations and the moral impact that this choice would have on future generations. Despite the hesitations of some members of the government and the military command, he authorized the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hoping that this would end the war quickly and without the need for further carnage. The bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, was a devastating action that led to Japan's unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945. However, Truman's decision was widely criticized and generated an intense moral debate that continues to this day. Many question the need to use the bomb, given Japan's already weakened resistance and the expectation that the war would be about to end without nuclear intervention. On the other hand, Truman, as leader during this critical period, argued that his decision was made to save lives in the long term, believing that the bomb brought a quicker end to the conflict without the United States or its allies having to suffer a devastating invasion. Regardless of how Truman's decision is viewed, his leadership during this period was one of the most challenging in history. Truman had to deal with a global war, a new nuclear threat, and the challenge of positioning the United States as a superpower in the post-war era. His decision to use the atomic bomb, while controversial, not only ended World War II, but also ushered in a new era in world military and political history, an era marked by the threat of nuclear weapons and the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The decision to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was undoubtedly one of the most significant in the military and political history of the United States. However, although the ultimate responsibility fell on President Harry S. Truman, he did not make this decision alone. Conversely, the action was shaped by a series of consultations and discussions with his key advisors and counselors, who played crucial roles in forming his choice. Among Truman's advisors, there were differences of opinion regarding the use of the bomb, but ultimately, their advice, along with the available intelligence data and information, had a decisive impact on the decision. One of Truman's most influential advisors was Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. Stimson, who had already been a prominent figure during the Roosevelt administration and possessed vast experience in military and diplomatic matters, was a proponent of the use of the atomic bomb, albeit with reservations. Stimson believed that the bomb could be an effective means of forcing Japan to surrender without the need for a bloody invasion. However, he also shared concerns about the moral aspects of this decision and suggested that if the bomb were to be used, it should be applied in a way that minimized the impact on the civilian population. He suggested, for example, that an attack be made against an uninhabited area or in a military demonstration that showed the destructive power of the weapon, before directly attacking a Japanese city. Despite these concerns, Stimson, like many other members of the government, believed that the use of the bomb was the best option to hasten the end of the war. Japan was, in fact, in a position of desperate resistance, and had shown little willingness to accept an unconditional surrender. Although Japanese forces were weakened and the war nearly won, the Japanese high command still held out hope for a negotiation that could preserve their honor in some of their territories. At one point, Stimson even suggested that instead of total destruction, a demonstration of the bomb in an uninhabited location might be enough to convince Japan to surrender without the need for a devastating attack on entire cities. Another crucial advisor to Truman was James F. Burns, who became Secretary of State in 1945, shortly after Roosevelt's death. Burns was an experienced politician and had great influence over Truman, as well as being an ardent advocate for the use of the bomb. He saw the atomic bomb as a necessary tool to end the war quickly and with as few deaths as possible, but he also recognized its geopolitical value. Burns believed that the demonstration of nuclear power by the United States would not only end Japanese resistance, but would also serve to send a clear message to the Soviet Union, which was beginning to expand its influence in Eastern Europe. The atomic bomb would be a way to guarantee the supremacy of the United States in the post-war world order. Burns' influence on Truman was substantial, and his discussions about the political implications of using the bomb likely played a significant role in the decision not only to use the bomb against Japan, but also to do so without waiting for formal peace negotiations with the Japanese. Unlike Stimson, who was more concerned with the humanitarian aspects of using the bomb, Burns had a more pragmatic perspective focused on ending the war decisively and without further delay. Another key advisor was General Leslie Groves, who was in charge of the Manhattan Project and oversaw the development of nuclear weapons. Groves was a practical and decisive military man, and his main priority was to ensure that the bomb was successfully developed and ready for use. He was not very concerned with the moral issues related to the use of the bomb, and his main function was to ensure that the weapon was available for use as soon as it was needed. Groves was convinced that the bomb would be an effective way to end the war quickly, and he worked hard to ensure that the necessary tests were carried out effectively, culminating in the Trinity test in July 1945. It was believed at the time that the bomb would have a profound psychological impact on Japan, and Groves was a tireless advocate for the immediate use of the weapon to force Japanese surrender. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of Allied forces in Europe and future President of the United States, also played an important role in discussions about the use of the bomb, although he was not directly involved in Truman's decision. Eisenhower publicly expressed his reservations about using the atomic bomb against Japan. During his visits to the Pacific, he had the chance to observe the situation in Japan closely and concluded that, with the imminent entry of the Soviet Union into the war, and with Japan already in a weakened position, a surrender without the use of nuclear weapons could be achieved without the need to destroy entire cities. He also had concerns about the moral and political consequences of such a devastating action. Eisenhower suggested that the United States could pressure Japan in other ways, such as through a more intense blockade or more conventional bombing. He argued the Japanese surrender was imminent, and that the use of an atomic bomb would be unnecessary as well as morally questionable. Considering the large number of Japanese civilians who could be killed, although their opposition was not enough to change the course of Truman's decision, it reflects the broader debate about the morality of using the atomic bomb, an issue that persists to this day. Truman's advisors, therefore, presented a set of divergent opinions, but they were all united by the idea that the atomic bomb could be the key to ending the war quickly and decisively. The common ground among the advisors most in favor of using the bomb was the conviction that an invasion of Japan would cause a much greater number of deaths, both for the United States and for the Japanese. They believed that the atomic bomb would be a more efficient means of forcing surrender without further bloodshed. In addition, the use of the bomb also had a strong strategic component. The United States wanted to secure a position of strength in the post-war period and, in particular, ensure that the Soviet Union did not take advantage of Japan's defeat to expand its influence in the Pacific. On the other hand, advisors like Eisenhower and other members of Roosevelt's team were more inclined to seek alternatives, either through increased diplomatic pressure or the use of even more intense conventional bombing, without resorting to the devastation of an entire city with a nuclear weapon. The discussion among Truman's advisors reflected in many respects the ethical and military dilemma of the period. Was it justifiable to use a weapon of mass destruction to end a war when there was a real chance of a conventional surrender? And what would be the consequences of such a decision for post-war morality and international relations? In the end, Truman's decision was largely influenced by advisors like Burns, Stimson, and Groves, who advocated the immediate use of the bomb. Although opposition from figures like Eisenhower was noted, the prospect of a prolonged war, with its enormous human casualties, was a decisive factor. The atomic bomb, therefore, became not only a weapon of war, but a geopolitical tool in a time of intense rivalry between the great powers, especially the United States and the Soviet Union. On August 6, 1945, the world witnessed the first nuclear attack in history. The city of Hiroshima, located in southern Japan, was chosen as the target for the first atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, due to its military and strategic importance. The decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima was not just a choice to destroy a city, but an attempt to force Japan to surrender without the need for a land invasion, which the Allies feared would be extremely costly in terms of human lives. However, the impact of the attack was devastating, not only for the city and its inhabitants, but also for the future of international relations and the perception of the use of nuclear weapons. The Little Boy bomb, which weighed about 4,400 kilograms and was approximately 3 meters long, was dropped at 9:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945 by a B-29 bomber called Enola Gay. The explosion was equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT, releasing an immense amount of energy in an instant. The detonation instantly destroyed most of the city, creating a fireball with temperatures so intense that it melted metals and charred everything around it. The pressure of the explosion was equally destructive, raising buildings and scattering debris for kilometers. It is estimated that at the time of the explosion, about 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly, while many others were seriously injured. Most of the victims were affected by radiation, which caused severe burns, and by collapsing buildings. In addition, many people who were a considerable distance from the explosion were still victims of long-term radiation effects, including cancer and degenerative diseases. The explosion also destroyed much of Hiroshima's infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, factories, and government buildings. In the following days, the survivors, known as hibakusha, faced the struggle for survival amidst a ruined city. In addition to the physical wounds caused by the bomb, many suffered profound psychological trauma due to the widespread destruction, the loss of loved ones, and radioactive contamination. The lack of adequate medical resources and the chaos in the streets hampered rescue efforts and care for the wounded. The immediate impact of Hiroshima was devastating, but the long-term impact was also significant. Radiation left its mark on thousands of people who did not die immediately but were affected by illnesses and conditions caused by radiation exposure, such as leukemia and cancer. Later studies conducted with survivors revealed the terrible consequences of atomic radiation, which affected not only the direct victims but also their families and future generations. The consequences of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and later Nagasaki became one of the main reasons for the creation of global movements against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The city of Hiroshima, after the bombing, was practically unrecognizable. The devastation was so great that even life forms were altered. The trees were burned, and the shadows of the charred victims were imprinted on the walls and sidewalks by the intensity of the radiation. The reconstruction of Hiroshima took decades, and the city, once an important industrial and military center, became a global symbol of peace and the fight against the use of nuclear weapons. This psychological impact was also profound, both for the Japanese and for the world. Hiroshima became the focal point of a moral debate regarding the use of weapons of mass destruction and the human cost of war. In the following years, Japan was forced to reconsider its stance of resistance in its military policy. The attack on Hiroshima was a devastating psychological blow to the Japanese leadership, which, along with the impact of the bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, led Japan to surrender on August 15, 1945, just 9 days after the attack. Japan's surrender would mark the end of World War II and open a new chapter in the history of international relations and the development of nuclear policies. Hiroshima, therefore, became not only a symbol of the destruction caused by the war, but also a symbol of resistance, resilience, and the global effort to prevent future nuclear catastrophes. Today, the city is a center of memory and reflection with the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum being one of the most visited places for those seeking to understand the impact of the atomic bombs. The city is also an icon of a broader movement for peace, with annual events and demonstrations promoting world peace and the elimination of nuclear weapons. Hiroshima is undoubtedly a reminder of the devastating power of nuclear weapons and the profound consequences these weapons have for societies, individuals, and the future of humanity. The impact of its destruction was so great that it not only changed the trajectory of the war, but also altered how the world views war and modern weaponry. 3 days after the attack on Hiroshima on August 9, 1945, the city of Nagasaki was targeted by the second atomic bomb, a bomb called Fat Man, dropped by the B-29 bomber. This attack, which was equally devastating, was carried out in a different context but with the same objective: to force Japan's surrender and end World War II. Nagasaki, located in southwestern Japan, was an important industrial center, but it also had a mountainous geography that made the destruction of the city more localized than in Hiroshima. Even so, the bomb caused immense destruction and killed tens of thousands of people. Fat Man was a plutonium-239 bomb with a different design from Little Boy dropped on Hiroshima, while Little Boy used uranium-235 and had a simpler form of nuclear fission. Fat Man used plutonium and had a more complex design based on implosion. This technical difference resulted in similar destructive power, but with a slightly different impact area. The bomb was dropped at 11:02 a.m., and the explosion had a devastating effect, instantly killing about 40,000 people, with the total number of victims rising to about 70,000 to 80,000, when the consequences of radiation and injuries began to be tested. The city of Nagasaki, with its mountains, was less vulnerable to total destruction than Hiroshima, but the areas affected by the explosion suffered severe damage. Many factories and industrial areas were razed, and thousands of homes were destroyed. As in Hiroshima, survivors faced a grim future with radiation, poisoning, burns, and the loss of family members. Radiation not only caused immediate effects, but also left an indelible mark on future generations. The hibakusha of Nagasaki, like those of Hiroshima, suffered throughout their lives from the stigma of radiation and from illnesses caused by radiation exposure. The attack on Nagasaki was carried out without warning, and the city was chosen after a change of plans for the original target. Initially, the city of Kokura had been chosen as the target for the second attack, but due to unfavorable weather conditions, the bomber was redirected to Nagasaki. The city, like Hiroshima, was far from a random target. It was a center for arms production, with several important military factories, which justified its inclusion on the list of targets for the attack. Despite being an important industrial city, Nagasaki also held great symbolic value. The city had been a major hub for contact with the West during Japan's period of isolation, and as such, had a rich and complex history. Its destruction brought even more tragedy to a Japan already devastated by war. However, after the attack on Nagasaki, Japanese leaders began to understand that the war could not continue. In addition to the immediate impact of the nuclear attacks, the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan with the invasion of Manchuria was what finally forced Japan to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made a public speech announcing Japan's surrender. Ending World War II, Japan's resistance had been broken not only by the physical destruction but also by the terrifying demonstration of the United States' nuclear power. Japan's decision to surrender after the attack on Nagasaki was a direct consequence of the psychological impact caused by the atomic bomb. coupled with military pressure and the Soviet invasion. Like Hiroshima, Nagasaki came to be seen as a symbol of the destruction caused by war and in particular by nuclear weapons. The impact of the bomb was profound, not only in Japan, but throughout the world. The nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki initiated a global movement to control and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, a struggle that continues to this day. The legacy of these attacks and the memory of the lives lost contributed to the growing awareness of the dangers of weapons of mass destruction and the desire to avoid a future marked by further nuclear catastrophe. The use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains one of the most controversial and debated topics in the history of World War II in 1945. The decision to drop these weapons of mass destruction was made within a context of total war, where traditional conventions and norms of combat had been largely abandoned. However, as time passed and the consequences of the use of the bombs became clearer, serious questions arose about the morality of this action. When Harry S. Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb, he did so with the conviction that he was making the most effective decision to end the war, save lives, and avoid a bloody invasion of the Japanese islands. For him and many of his advisors, the bomb was seen as a way to end the conflict quickly and without further bloodshed, both American and Japanese. However, the immediate devastation and long-term impacts of the atomic bombs have led many to question whether this decision was justified, not only in military terms but also in ethical terms. Justifications for the use of the bomb. The main justification presented by the United States government for the use of the atomic bomb was that it was necessary to force Japan to surrender and avoid the need for an invasion that would cause millions of deaths, both on the American and Japanese sides. Before the nuclear attacks, the American military had estimated that the invasion of Japan would result in approximately 500,000 to 1 million American casualties, in addition to millions of Japanese civilians killed during the fighting. The battle for the island of Okinawa, which ended in July 1945, had been one of the bloodiest of the war, with over 200,000 dead, mostly Japanese civilians. Given this recent history of intense battles and human losses, the atomic bomb seemed too many, the best option to end the war quickly and decisively. Furthermore, the United States was in a geopolitical race with the Soviet Union, which was beginning to expand in Eastern Europe and had plans to enter the war against Japan. For U.S. leaders, the use of the atomic bomb was also a way to demonstrate American military superiority, sending a clear message to the Soviet regime. In this context, the bomb was not only a weapon to defeat Japan, but also a trump card in post-war international diplomacy. Controversies and questions despite the military justifications. The use of atomic bombs in densely populated cities, such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, generated criticism and profound ethical questions. The number of civilians killed was immense, between 100,000 and 200,000 people. Mostly civilians lost their lives due to the immediate explosions, in addition to the deaths caused by radiation in the following days and years. These numbers led many people to question whether the use of such a destructive weapon was really necessary. Furthermore, Japan was already in a very weakened position. Most of its armed forces had been defeated and its cities were being devastated by conventional air attacks. In addition, Japan was, in many respects, politically isolated, with the naval blockade and the inability to obtain vital resources. Many argue that Japan was closer to surrender than the United States government recognized at the time. Some scholars and political figures, such as General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who commanded the Allied forces in Europe, believed that Japan was already ready to surrender and that the nuclear attacks were not necessary to end the war. Eisenhower, for example, questioned whether the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was justified, considering the suffering inflicted on innocent civilians. Furthermore, there is the argument that the bombing was an act of revenge or a display of power rather than a practical measure to end the war. The use of such a devastating weapon against a defenseless population at a time when Japan was nearly defeated raises serious questions about the limits of the use of force and the morality of using a weapon that can completely destroy entire cities and kill civilians on a large scale. The moral impact in the post-war period, the use of the atomic bomb also had a profound moral impact on global society. The attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered in an era of fear and uncertainty, marked by the constant threat of nuclear war. During the Cold War, the balance of power between the nuclear powers, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, was maintained not by diplomacy, but by the fear of mutually assured destruction. The atomic bomb, while ending World War II, also ushered in a new era of nuclear threats, which dominated international relations for several decades. This shift was accompanied by a growing movement against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. In the years following the end of the war, international organizations and activists began to question the ethics of using nuclear weapons and their capacity to destroy human life on an unprecedented scale. In 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, and in 1968, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons (NPT) was adopted, marking an attempt to control the use and spread of nuclear weapons. Furthermore, the memory of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki became a symbol of resistance to nuclear war. Hiroshima, in particular, became a focal point for the promotion of world peace, with the city annually holding Hiroshima Peace Day, which seeks to remind the world of the nuclear tragedies and advocate for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Conclusion on morality and controversies. Ultimately, the use of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki raises difficult questions about the nature of war, the ethics of using weapons of mass destruction, and the human cost of military decisions. For many, the atomic bomb represented a necessary evil to end a devastating global war, while for others, it was an unnecessary and immoral act that not only killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, but also ushered in a new era of nuclear terror. The controversies continue to this day, with people from different perspectives trying to understand the balance between the need to end the war quickly and the consequences of using such powerful weapons. Whatever perspective is adopted, the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki left an indelible mark on history and continue to be a central theme in debates about ethics, war, and the responsibility of nuclear powers in the modern world. The use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 not only altered the dynamics of World War II, but also had global repercussions that permanently changed international relations. The international reaction to the use of these weapons was mixed, ranging from strategic support to moral condemnation. However, all reactions were, in one way or another, linked to the new geopolitical reality and the awakening of the nuclear threat, which came to dominate world politics in the following decades. Immediate reactions in Japan. The immediate impact was the surrender of the Japanese government. After the bombings, Japan was in an irremediably weakened position, and the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a devastating psychological blow to the Japanese leadership. The decision to surrender was made on August 15, 1945, with the formal declaration of surrender occurring after Emperor Hirohito's speech. Japan's surrender was in fact a necessary outcome to end World War II, but the use of atomic bombs also created an internal division in the country. Many Japanese felt humiliated by having been the target of such a devastating attack, while others saw the surrender as salvation from an even more destructive scenario with the prospect of an invasion. In other parts of the world, the reaction was equally complex. The Allied powers, such as the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, were aware that the use of the atomic bomb would hasten the end of the war, but they also had concerns about its destructive power and the implications for international diplomacy. The Soviet Union, which had agreed to enter the war against Japan, was particularly alarmed by the fact that the United States possessed such a powerful weapon, which would alter the balance of power in the post-war period. Reactions in the United States. Within the United States, the reaction to the use of atomic bombs was mixed. Many Americans, especially military leaders, considered the attacks justified. Given the enormous pressure to end the war and avoid further casualties, the use of the bomb was widely supported by those directly involved in the war, including many members of Congress who saw the attack as a necessary evil to save lives and end a devastating world conflict. Nationalist sentiment of justice and the idea that Japan deserved punishment for its aggression against the Pearl Harbor naval base in 1941 fueled this opinion. On the other hand, some intellectuals and public figures in the United States began to question the morality of using the bombs. Scientists who had participated in the Manhattan Project, such as J. Robert Oppenheimer, expressed deep remorse about the impact of their creations, although many of them were still convinced that the bomb had been necessary to defeat a relentless enemy. Others, such as General Dwight D. Eisenhower, opposed the use of the bombs, arguing that Japan was already on the verge of surrender. Reactions from the Soviet Union and Europe. The Soviet Union was one of the first powers to react negatively to the use of atomic bombs. Stalin and other Soviet leaders were alarmed by the power of nuclear weapons, which, in their minds, not only changed the nature of war, but also represented a direct threat to their own security and influence in the post-war world. The Soviets, who had lost millions of people fighting Germany, saw the use of the bomb as a way for the United States to reaffirm its world leadership in military supremacy. This event had a direct impact on relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the nuclear arms race that followed was one of the main characteristics of the Cold War in Europe. Many countries were still processing the horrors of the war, and the reaction to the use of the bombs was mixed. Although most Allied countries recognized that the end of the war had been achieved, many questioned whether the use of such weapons had been necessary or ethical. The massive destruction of entire cities and the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians generated a debate about the limits of the use of force in wartime. The New World Order and the awakening to the nuclear threat, the use of atomic bombs, also marked the beginning of the nuclear age in international politics. The devastating power of nuclear weapons caused the world's superpowers to begin reassessing their military strategies. Nuclear weapons came to be seen as tools not only for war, but also for deterrence. The nuclear arms race during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was a direct consequence of the use of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The balance of power was redefined, and the superpowers, now armed with nuclear weapons, sought to establish a system of mutual deterrence known as mutually assured destruction, which would prevent the use of these weapons in a direct conflict. The use of atomic bombs also led to the creation of international organizations focused on controlling and preventing the use of nuclear weapons. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT) was signed with the aim of preventing more countries from developing nuclear weapons and promoting global nuclear disarmament. Although the treaty was a significant step toward preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, the world continues to live with the threat of the use of such weapons, especially as more countries enter the nuclear field. The legacy of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is an indelible mark on world history. Although World War II ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945, the effects of these attacks continue to affect the world to this day, both in terms of global politics and moral and humanitarian issues. In addition to ending the war, the nuclear attacks opened the door to a new era in human history, an era in which the threat of global destruction became a tangible reality, global impact, and the peace movement after the attacks. The atomic bombs quickly became symbols of devastation and the deadly power that science and technology can provide when misused. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became powerful symbols in the movement for peace and the elimination of nuclear weapons since 1945. Cities around the world have promoted Hiroshima Peace Day, an event that seeks to raise awareness of the horrors of nuclear weapons and promote the idea of a world free of atomic weapons. The devastation caused by the bombs generated increasing pressure for the creation of international disarmament treaties. In 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, followed by the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons (NPT) in 1968. These treaties aimed to control the development and testing of nuclear weapons. Although the proliferation of atomic weapons continued, especially in the context of the Cold War, when the nuclear-armed superpowers were at an impasse, the impact on Japan and the world in Japan, the impact of the bombs was and continues to be profound. The survivors of the attacks, known as Hibakusha, became the leading voices advocating for peace and the elimination of nuclear weapons. Many of them dedicated their lives to warning the world about the consequences of nuclear war and promoting peace. The Hibakusha communities helped form a base of activism against nuclear proliferation and helped create a culture of peace in Japan that still persists today. The reconstruction of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was also a symbol of resilience and a new beginning. Japan, with international aid, managed to rebuild these cities and use them as symbols of peace, with Hiroshima in particular becoming a world center for nuclear disarmament initiatives and the promotion of peace. The legacy of the bombs, however, is also marked by the continuing threat of the use of nuclear weapons. Although there have been significant efforts to limit and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, the world still lives under the shadow of this threat. Countries with nuclear arsenals, such as the United States, Russia, and China, continue to modernize their arsenals, and new countries continue to develop nuclear weapons. The survivors of the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as Hibakusha, have been an important source of testimonies and memories about the attacks and their devastating effects. The stories of suffering, loss, and resistance of these people are crucial to understanding the human consequences of the nuclear bombings and to keeping the memory of these historical events alive. The Hibakusha's experience is not merely a personal memory, but a fundamental part of the collective history of Japan and the world. Since the attacks in 1945, the Hibakusha have been tireless advocates for peace and the elimination of nuclear weapons. Many of their stories have been recorded in books, films, and exhibitions, with the aim of educating future generations about the horrors of the use of nuclear weapons. The physical and psychological impacts, the hibakusha faced serious physical damage due to radiation. In addition to the immediate burns caused by the explosion, many suffered long-term effects such as cancers, heart disease, and internal organ damage. Furthermore, radiation exposure caused genetic mutations, affecting not only the direct survivors but also their children and grandchildren. The psychological effects of the attacks were also profound. Hibakusha often described the experience as a trauma that never went away. Many lost their families and friends and lived with the weight of being survivors of a catastrophe that killed hundreds of thousands. The shame and stigma associated with radiation were also significant issues for many. Radiation victims, especially those with visible illnesses or deformities, were often discriminated against by other Japanese people who feared the effects of radiation. The fight for peace, the hibakusha did not simply keep their memories to themselves. Many dedicated their lives to warning the world about the consequences of nuclear war and advocating for global nuclear They participated in demonstrations, wrote open letters, and engaged in international initiatives to ensure that future generations would never, again, face the threat of nuclear destruction. Their voices helped create a culture of peace in Japan, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki becoming global centers for peace advocacy. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, became known for his decision to authorize the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This act, which culminated in the end of World War II, is perhaps the greatest and most controversial legacy of his presidency. However, what is often overlooked is the emotional and political loneliness with which Truman dealt when making this historic decision. Although he was the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces, the responsibility of ordering the use of the atomic bomb weighed heavily on his shoulders, and the decision, made under enormous pressure, would have consequences that would echo for decades throughout history. Truman has often been portrayed as a pragmatic leader who made the difficult decision to quickly end the devastating war. His choice was motivated by a number of factors, including the desire to save American lives and force a surrender from Japan, which seemed unyielding. However, the decision to use nuclear weapons against two Japanese cities was so monumental that Truman could never escape the moral and political repercussions of his action. It was not just a military decision, but a matter of fundamental human values. Truman's loneliness and the pressure to decide when Truman took office in 1945. He found himself in the midst of a war that had already decimated millions of people. His predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had made important political and military decisions. But the issue of atomic bombs was something Truman had to face alone. Although the Manhattan Project had been underway for some time, Truman did not have a deep understanding of nuclear bombs until he became president. During his brief time as vice president, he did not have access to classified information related to the weapon, and it was only after Roosevelt's death that Truman was fully informed about the bomb's development. The task of deciding whether and how to use the bomb was an unprecedented responsibility. There was no historical precedent for such a weapon, and the risks of a wrong decision were immense. If he used the bomb, Truman knew he would, in a sense, be initiating a new era of destruction. But if he chose not to use it, he would face the consequences of a possible invasion of Japan, which would lead to more deaths among Allied forces and Japanese civilians. The pressure to end the war as quickly as possible and avoid further casualties was immense. And Truman knew that, regardless of his decision, he would be criticized. He knew the bomb could be the key to saving lives in the future. But the weight of the destruction it would bring also weighed on his conscience. The fact that he would be authorizing an attack that would kill tens of thousands of civilians was a reality he had to live with after the act. However, Truman's loneliness lay not only in the decision itself, but in the reactions that this decision would generate. He knew that history would judge him, and he was aware that once the bomb was used, there would be no going back. The lack of precedence and the impossibility of predicting the future. One of the reasons Truman felt isolated when making this decision was the lack of precedence to guide him. Never before in history had the world faced the possibility of the mass destruction of an entire city by means of a single weapon. Although the military leaders of his time were aware of the destructive power of nuclear weapons, no one knew exactly what the impact of a large-scale nuclear war would be. As Truman prepared to authorize the use of the bombs, he knew he was creating a dangerous precedent for the future. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not only cause an immediate catastrophe, but would also initiate a nuclear arms race with profound consequences for global geopolitics. What Truman could not foresee, however, was the psychological impact of the bomb, both in Japan and in the rest of the world. He could not anticipate the fear and insecurity that humanity would feel in the following decades, as nuclear weapons became a pillar of military strategy during the Cold War. Furthermore, Truman could not foresee the rise of the global movement against nuclear weapons, which would have a lasting impact on international politics and relations between the superpowers. The fact that the United States would be recognized not only as the nation that won World War II, but also as the first to use nuclear weapons in combat placed Truman in a unique position in history, and he would carry that weight for the rest of his life. Moral and philosophical repercussions. Truman's decision also generated intense moral and philosophical reflection, which continues to be debated to this day. Although Truman justified his action as necessary to end the war and save lives, he was constantly confronted with questions about whether there were other alternatives to forcing Japan to surrender without resorting to nuclear destruction. The fact that Japan was already in a position of weakness, with its military forces collapsing and its resources dwindling, leads many historians and critics to question whether the use of the bomb was truly necessary. In the following years, figures such as General Dwight D., scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, and other members of the government and the military questioned whether the atomic bomb was truly the only viable option. Oppenheimer himself, who oversaw the development of the bomb in the Manhattan Project, expressed regret for having helped create such a devastating weapon. In his later years, Oppenheimer became deeply troubled by the moral implications of the use of nuclear weapons and the consequences of dropping the first bombs on Japan, Truman's decision and its impact on his legacy. Although Truman was widely supported at the time by many of the United States' leading leaders and advisors, his decision to use the atomic bomb has cast a shadow over his legacy. For years after the war, he defended his decision, arguing that the bomb had been necessary to save lives and hasten the end of the war. However, as time passed, the weight of criticism grew, and many began to question the morality of his choice. Looking to the future, Truman's decision was not just an isolated event, but a landmark that shaped world politics in the following decades. The use of the atomic bomb not only ended World War II, but also laid the groundwork for the Cold War, in which the fear of constant nuclear war would dominate international relations. Truman's legacy is therefore marked by the loneliness of his decision. He had to choose between total war, with its enormous human losses, and the destruction of an enemy with a weapon that would change history forever. He was undoubtedly a pragmatic leader, but also a man who faced the weight of his own humanity and the consequences of his choices. The loneliness he felt when making that decision is a characteristic that accompanies him to this day, and the discussion of whether he did right or wrong remains one of the most complex and controversial issues in 20th century history.